Students Who Design is a podcast and video series that bridges students and the design industry. By students, for students. Be sure to check out our website, studentswho.design.
This is Students Who Design.
Today we'll be talking to Ethan Bond. He studied computer science and product design at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, and he's currently a product designer at Palantir.
In this episode, we'll cover the ethics of design, finding your first design projects, and so much more. We hope you enjoy this episode.
Students Who Design is sponsored in part by Facebook Design. For more resources and information on designing at Facebook, visit facebook.design and check out open roles at facebook.com/careers.
Hey Ethan, so first off, we'd like to introduce what school you graduated from, your major, and where you're working now.
So I went to RPI, Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute in Troy, New York, and I studied product design and computer science. Right now, I am a product designer at Palantir Technologies.
Cool, and how did you get into product design?
So I got into product design mostly because my mom was an artist growing up, and so I always had an interest in the creative stuff. But it took me until about high school to realize that I can't actually draw at all. And right around that same time, I actually read Predictably Irrational, which you have listed on your website.
It's like one of my favorite books.
By Dan Ariely, which introduced me to behavioral economics and kind of the power that psychology and design can have in decision making. And so that's what kind of brought me into design.
And what made you want to major in both product design and computer science at RPI? And do you think that a technical degree like computer science added to or detracted from your progress?
I attended RPI primarily for the product design program, which at the time in 2012, when I was looking at colleges, they were pretty rare. And so I applied to RPI for that, got in for that, and then kind of figured that I was at a school that had a world-class computer science program and might as well give it a shot. And I ended up actually not graduating from RPI with either degree. And I'm 2 classes short of a computer science degree.
But you don't want to go back and just finish those classes?
I think someday. I tell myself that I will someday. But I think that adding a technical degree probably detracted from my path into product design, in that it was just another thing to focus on. And so getting, quote unquote, distracted by non-design things. But I also think that it's one of the most valuable parts of my education now that I'm working as a product designer. The technical side of things has been enormously helpful.
So I want to quickly talk about the things that you were involved in at school or at RPI. So since 2013, you've been doing a bunch of hackathons, side projects, leading design at college factual. How did you find these opportunities, and what did you use to motivate yourself to pursue them?
Yeah, so the opportunities kind of, for the most part, came to me, which, as stereotypical of an answer as it is, it's all about networking. And RPI, fortunately, the professors tend to come from industry rather than just from academia. And so if you stand out in class, your name will kind of just come up in conversations outside of the classroom. And so fostering that network with your professors or with just the industry or the hackathon circuit. I had a lot of friends in the computer science program who were very invested in the hackathon circuit.
Yeah, back in 2013, 14, 15, that was the thing.
Yeah.
You used to go to all the hackathons you could every weekend.
Yeah. So, and that's enormously helpful because that kind of...
But how did you find your place as a designer at hackathons? I think that's a huge thing. It's for anyone who can code, it's 24 hours, let's just put this thing together. But design, it's what do you do in 24 hours?
Yeah, I think that's one of the more fundamental challenges of being a designer, is justifying design. And that's actually what's really helpful about hackathons, is you learn pretty early how to justify the role that design can have. And at hackathons in particular, it's actually pretty enormous because, it's the difference between a product looking like a hackathon and feeling like a hackathon product that was actually hacked together in 24 hours versus just that extra layer of polish that just makes things look a lot more real.
So you think working in parallel with the people who are hacking it together and then converging the last final hours is the best way to make impact?
Yeah, I mean, I hesitate to say like converging at the last
Yeah,
final hour.
yeah, yeah.
I think the ideal case is like a really tight iteration cycle, primarily led by design, but learning how to interact with engineers in that type of environment and with those types of stresses going on is a really valuable skill to have.
Mm-hmm. And so where do you think that aspiring designers can look to or look for in a university setting to continue improving their craft?
I think the main thing you're going to want to do is to basically construct your feedback loop. I'm of the mind that a design education can't actually teach you to be a better designer.
Even though you went and you did a design degree?
Yeah.
Okay.
I think that a design education mostly teaches you how to talk about design, which is important, it's valuable, but it doesn't actually by definition make you a better designer. What you do have the opportunity to do though there is to build the feedback loop and to find a trusted mentor or a trusted set of mentors. And the way you get better at design is by simply doing design over and over and over again and having the feedback loop that you trust in order to focus your work and reorient your work and actually make it stronger. As far as what designers can do outside of that, I mean, I think for me, most of the differentiation is going to come actually from the work you do outside of design. So whether it's learning how to code, which I don't think that designers should necessarily learn how to code.
Okay. Why is that?
So I think the benefit of knowing how to code is not actually the act of writing code itself. The way that I frame this is that design, a lot of people have this misunderstanding that design is about the mock-ups or it's about the prototypes or it's about like the actual like exhaust of the design process. But the actual design process is actually just a matter of, it's a complicated game of cost-benefit analysis, right? Whether it's the benefit to the user or the cost to the engineering team or the cost to the business. Mm-hmm. And the more, as a designer, the more of these different facets of costs and benefits that you can understand and like truly articulate and pull into your process, the better you are at doing cost-benefit analysis. And so, if you're a designer who has never had to write, a crazy custom UI, then you don't have a strong understanding of the technical costs that you're incurring by making the decisions that you're making.
But don't you think that if you build these systems and you inherently know before you even create them that this will be a cost?
I think that you don't have a strong understanding of that cost without not necessarily having done it yourself, but without putting specific effort towards understanding that cost.
Okay, so it's more about understanding rather than actually like typing out.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
So long as you can understand the costs that you're incurring, then I think that that's the benefit of learning how to code. Maybe you can get that same benefit without actually learning how to code.
By just working with engineers.
Working closely and learning how to speak about engineering with engineers.
So you almost finished a design degree. I would say you finished the degree. Looking back, what were the advantages and disadvantages of majoring in product design? And if you had to do it again, would you major in a design?
Yeah, I think I would, and that's especially true at RPI because it's such an engineering-heavy school. It was really important to have like the creative outlet and just the creative community of design. So I would think I would do it again. Again, though, like I don't necessarily feel that it made me a better designer so much as it equipped me to speak about design. Which is valuable, but again, I don't think it's quite the same.
Why do you think students should learn how to communicate the value of design? Or why is that important, rather than just like knowing how to design?
Yeah, I mean, right now, I think design is kind of riding a wave of essentially that was triggered by Apple, and then now you have Slack and Facebook and all these companies that are very design centric. And so right now, I think a lot of the design community is kind of benefiting from this assumption of ROI and this assumption of value. And in some contexts, that's probably a warranted thing. But I also think in many contexts, it's actually not quite a given and it's not quite a known thing. And so
not at all,
as an example, at Palantir, which also a very engineering heavy environment, does a lot of enterprise software. Their designers do have to justify a lot of the decisions that they're making because it's not quite the assumption, and I don't think it should be the assumption that good design is going to be worth it in the long term.
So you think practicing your intentionality very early on is a skill that is extremely valuable?
Totally.
I think what you're saying is like you can create and think about all these different solutions, but when you present them, you have to have a reason as to why you did certain things.
Totally. If you're going to make it, and this becomes especially true, if you're designing micro interactions, you're designing like a fairly minor thing, a fairly small thing, then
relative to the system.
To the system, then the cost of building it isn't quite that large. But as you move up through the design ranks and as you're taking on larger and larger responsibilities and making decisions about product strategy, for example, those decisions basically increase exponentially in the potential cost to the business. And you have to justify why you think your voice matters in those decisions.
But in a university setting, in the sense that you're not working with a product with metrics and revenue, etc., and you almost have this kind of like free-for-all imagination, and a lot of people will be like, oh, I think that GroupMe should have a polling system. Okay, I'm going to make a case study out of this. And so let's say they do that. How can they or that student think about the business costs and the technical constraints that this might have when they're not surrounded by, GroupMe's engineers and PMs?
Oh, totally. I mean, I think it's going to be impossible to get a real grasp on what the real constraints
how can you
around a problem
that
are
early on?
Well, I think hackathons, for example, is one good way to do that because you have the technical constraints and you have the time constraints.
And you have the presentation as well.
And you have the presentation, and so you have to kind of orient around those goals and you're constrained by those things. And that's kind of why I'm not personally a fan of these kind of like blue sky design projects where you can just go crazy and design all this crazy stuff. Because again, like design is not really about the mock-up that gets produced, right? It's about the process of cost-benefit analysis. And if there's no cost to anything you're doing besides your own time, then your analysis skills aren't really getting very good.
So now I'd like to touch more on the career-oriented part of the podcast and how students can really jumpstart their careers. So first off, how did you get your first opportunity or internship, and what did you do to stand out during that first phase of recruiting, or just first position, because that's usually the hardest?
Yeah, so in high school, I got actually really involved with the Android theming modification community quite a while back.
What is that?
And so the Android UI back in the 2010 era was pretty horrendous.
Yeah.
And so there's a bunch of hackers basically rooting phones or jailbreaking phones and then changing out the graphics and making all these cool little things. So I got involved with that in high school and had a decent bit of success doing that because most of the people doing it were highly technical, and so the design sense wasn't quite there yet. So I kind of came out ahead of that and got lucky there. Ended up meeting somebody who pulled me into a design internship right after high school, between high school and college.
Oh, wow.
And that was in Las Vegas and at a really small hardware startup. And so that was kind of maybe my first professional opportunity, I guess. And from there, it was just a matter of again, cultivating the network and having opportunities come to you, and then also just being open to them. The way I got involved with Palantir is actually a little bit weird in that I went to the career fair, it's the very first career fair.
As a freshman.
As a freshman at RPI, and Palantir at the time had a reputation for being notoriously harsh at turning people down at career fairs. And so I figured, hey, might as well just get shut down right quick and then just get over it. Get over the fear, get over the jitters. And so I went up to Palantir's table first and foremost, and lucked out in that nobody at the table was a designer. The design team at the time, I think, was 5 people. Oh, wow. And so none of them were there. Design doesn't recruit at RPI. And So I kind of slid by because they didn't know what to ask me.
So like they couldn't turn you down, but they
Yeah,
didn't know what to do.
so they just like passed on my resume. I ended up interviewing for Palantir, so that flying out to Palo Alto that year. Didn't get an offer, but was asked to return to interview again the following year.
Okay.
And so I did my sophomore year.
And what did you learn from that first time that they said no after the on-site? Or what did you learn from that experience, and how did you improve the second time? Because it clearly worked out.
Yeah, so a big part of it was this idea that they were kind of drilling into my head during the interviews of like going back to the user. And so I actually had kind of, again, like the perennial challenge of being a designer in these types of environments of like, how do you justify the value of design? And at my internship that I had near school at the time, I was basically having that challenge of like justifying the work that I was trying to do. And at Palantir, they just drilled it in, like, go to the users, go to the metrics, and nobody can turn away from it. Mm-hmm. And so then when I went back to school, I basically oriented more heavily around learning how to do that and doing user research and doing metrics. And then went back to Palantir with that knowledge and ended up getting an internship.
Cool. And so you've worked at both Palantir and Facebook, and now you're currently at Palantir. What are some things that both of those companies that are both extremely design driven, in your experience, prioritize when they're looking or interviewing designers?
Yeah, so I think that Facebook tends to orient or kind of index more heavily on specialties with designers, like people who are like especially good at micro interactions, or people who are especially good at visual design, or kind of they have their expertise. And I think that that's basically a consequence of them having a lot of designers and a huge design team, which is totally reasonable. Palantir is kind of on the opposite side of the spectrum, where we have a really small design team. And so as a result, and we're like very engineering heavy. And so as a result, we tend to prioritize a lot of generalists. Mm-hmm. And specifically like this idea of T-shaped expertise, right? So you have like one thing that you're super good at, but you should have a wide range of at least interests, if nothing else. And so whether that's like business or technology or systems design or organizational design, that T-shaped expertise is really important at Palantir.
So you were an intern at Palantir for over 5 months, including the summer, and you've been at Palantir as a full-time designer for about over a year. What are some of the differences that you noticed in your work as an intern, or the responsibilities that you had, or the way you approach problems versus full-time, or as a full-timer, and what do interns do that full-time designers don't?
The main thing that interns do that full-timers don't is worry about return offers. I think that's the main thing. Yeah, Palantir, like the kind of, again, like as a consequence of a strategy of understaffing pretty much everything. Interns are basically full-time designers for all intents and purposes, and they have essentially a lot of the same roles and responsibilities at like the ground level. I think the main difference is then how large of responsibilities can you take on, and that's just a factor of time more so than your role. But so Palantir, like full-time now, I've kind of grown to doing more product strategy type stuff, and kind of like leading a development team and like leading a product team, which obviously as an intern I was a little bit more like designing a specific piece of a UI. And so the ability to take on the challenges that are interesting to me and like going in front of clients and demoing to C-suites and stuff like that is something that interns can do, but it's just a matter of how much time it's going to take to get there.
That's true, considering you only have 10 or 12 weeks.
Right.
And so as a student designer, you're often focusing on like, oh, okay, I have my portfolio, but it's not visual designing enough, and like you go focus on visual design, or vice versa with any other part of design. What do you think that students usually forget when they're interviewing at companies, or kind of, they're interviewing the company, and what they should look for?
Yeah, so on the portfolio perspective, I think one part of it is that designers should gear their portfolio towards the type of design that they want to be doing. So if you want to be doing a lot of visual design and doing 54 iterations of a button, then sure, make that kind of like what your portfolio is geared towards. if you're interested in getting more to like the strategy side of things, then your portfolio is probably going to have a lot more text in it and a lot more, some more numbers and things like that. So that's more what I was interested in. And so, I mean, if you go to my website today, there's like not an image on it.
Yeah.
The other part of that of like designers interviewing the companies, I think that this is something I feel really passionately about. I think designers are uniquely positioned to kind of, as a nexus between the business and the product and the users and engineering. They're kind of uniquely positioned to guide things in a way that isn't limited to just the UI itself,
okay.
right? They can choose to kind of shift the product direction, and a big part of that is shifting it in a more ethical direction. I think that designers in general have I think there's maybe it's something natural or inherent or like closely related to design that creates this, but designers tend to care a lot more deeply about the ethics of what they're doing than a lot of other people in tech. And I think that designers should take that really seriously and leverage that to the fullest extent that they can. And I think it requires just like a lot of deep intellectual honesty about what it is that you are designing and what it is that you're building and what it is that you're enabling. And creating a framework about how you want to assess the impact that you're having in the world is really critical.
And so you went through, I think we already said, many internships and currently at Palantir. What would you recommend to students who might be in their very first startup gig or freelance gig, but they want to level up to either a big tech company or a very famous agency, or just level up in their career overall?
Yeah, I think again, like the most important thing is constructing that feedback loop that you trust, and then once you have that, so like whether it's a mentor or a manager or a friend whose feedback you trust, just producing tons and tons and tons of work and just running it through that feedback loop, and then just getting better and better and better. So that's one part of it. On the flip side, I also think again that people can benefit enormously by spreading their interests well outside of design. Okay. So whether that's on business or psychology or ethics or communication, these are all things that are actually going to help you to not just justify design's influence, but actually like grow it in huge ways. Again, as the nexus between all of these different components of the business, you have to learn how to talk to people in those terms that they care about. And I mean, the earlier you can start doing that, the better off you are.
So this last segment is questions that we ask every guest, and it's essentially what's on the minds of students right now. So we pulled a bunch of Facebook groups, pulled on Medium and some Twitter polls, and this is what were the most chosen options. So the first question is, having the experience that you do, there are probably some things that you feel like the full-time or the current design industry doesn't quite get about the student design community. And we're wondering if you could speak a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think I would actually probably reverse this and say that the thing that designers, especially young designers, don't understand about the industry is it goes again back to like justifying the ROI of design. I don't think you can just assume that design is worthwhile, and you have to learn to justify what it is that you're doing.
So you're saying like a student's working on a case study or like trying to make a feature or something, like ruthlessly trying to figure out why does this matter?
Right. So figuring out figuring out why it matters, and then also trying again like to simulate actual constraints that actually exist in the real world, whether it's the engineering cost or the business cost or whatever. Trying to understand those and internalize them as much as possible is going to make the transition into the real world that much easier.
So you have a lot to manage from, whether it's life, school, work, or previous to school. How do you try to stay on top of it all?
I have no idea. I've never had like a good system to do it. I think it's basically, if I had to sum it up, it would just be avoiding sleep. Yeah. I think prioritizing is really important, but there's a lot that is important to me, like between school and social life, and obviously the design work that I was trying to do. I pretty much everything outside of that basically like cut it out, but even those three things were more than enough to keep me busy.
To keep you awake as well.
Yeah, keep me awake.
So there's a lot of articles, books, newsletters, and just content in the design industry. How do you filter out what's relevant to you and what's good content versus what is just noise?
Yeah, so I actually pretty aggressively filter out most tech information and news, and aggressively filter out most design stuff. The reason for that is I think it just becomes way too easy to get kind of like into a distorted worldview about where tech and design fits in the grander scheme of things. So I think like casting a wider net on where you derive inspiration, where you derive motivation and information from is actually a good thing, right? So again, going to philosophy, going to ethics, going to communication, rhetoric.
So everything you read, because you're already working in this for 8 hours, 10 hours a day. So then the flip side, the rest of the hours that you spend, you probably want to widen your horizon.
Yeah. So I spent a lot of time like, behavioral economics or economics in general, political philosophy, stuff like that.
And do you have any mentors that you follow or have to stay inspired, or resources that might act as pseudo mentors?
I think like within Palantir, the kind of people who have been here doing design here for a longer time than I, so like Mark Schaefer and Eric Grissman, Tony Poore, and then Bango, he's the head of design here at Palantir, are really, kind of really big mentors for me. But it's just a matter of like seeking out kind of that feedback loop. And so for everybody, it's going to be different. I don't really buy into the whole like idolizing designers who you don't actually talk to.
Yeah, you see on Twitter. Yeah.
Right, yeah. I think it's too easy, again, to like get this distorted view of what design actually is.
So as a design leader at RPI, I'm sure that there are students who came up to you asking for advice. And I'm sure there's students or just people who might be 30, 40 years old who want to switch into this career. And what immediate actionable pieces of advice would you give them to get started?
I mean, practice and just keep doing design as much as possible. Figure out how you can learn to articulate yourself regarding design. You can't.
By practice, do you mean like the tools or like the craft, or is it like go to Dribble and try to make that stuff again? Because I think that's the confusion is that like, do you practice what you see? Do you remix things?
Yeah, so I think part of it, I think there's no problem doing like imitative stuff, especially when you're first beginning, but like mostly for learning the tools. And there's of course value in like getting good at actually using Sketch, or there's value in like learning how to draw or do all of these things. So in terms of like raw skills, like technical skills, definitely imitation I think is fine. After that, it's a matter of how do you translate your passion for design outside of the tools, because a trap I think a lot of people fall into is like seeing the mock-up as the design, and that's not really what it is.
The mock-up is just the medium to explore the solution.
Right. And like, if you're, and this becomes very apparent when you're working on a really small team, for example, like a 2-person team for the past several months. I didn't do any mock-ups because I had nobody that I had to communicate my design vision to, right? So I was just building it. And that kind of emphasizes like that the mock-up is not the design. So that's I think that's what I mean by practice, is like first get good at the technical skills that you need to have, and then after that bias very heavily towards learning the process of design, and then learning how to talk about the process of design.
So we've talked a lot about what you've done and how you've gotten here. What's next for you?
Man, well, hopefully finishing my degree.
Go back to RPI
at some point. Yeah, I keep telling myself I'll do that. And then outside from that, just hopefully taking on larger and larger responsibility at Palantir for the foreseeable future.
Cool. Thank you so much for joining us, Ethan.
Thank you.
Students Who Design is written and produced by Sahil Koja and Omar Abdul Rahim. Visit our website, studentswho.design, for more information.